I think you should sing it, Devil.
I don't know. This is a serious topic, Alex.
Go on. Come on, do it.
All right. La cucaracha ya no puede caminar porque no tiene, porque le falta marihuana que fumar.
Now, why on earth would you start singing that on such a somber topic as drug trade?
Well, if you listen to the lyrics right at the end, it talks about marijuana, so it's in some way related. And the reason the song talks about marijuana is because this was sung by the soldiers of Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution, because they would use marijuana for medicinal purposes to help them with pain following battles.
Of course, what's interesting here is it's the revolution, it's soldiers, it tends to be working class people. And of course, that carries with it prejudice. And this is what I think is fascinating about this period, because it's the beginning of the origins of what would become the drug war, which is all the prejudice that comes with drugs, in actual fact, comes from social and political contexts. And so the weed that people were smoking became an issue to the Mexican governing class. And so within a few years, many Mexican states had banned weed when it was still actually legal in the US. So you actually had, in the 1910s and 1920s onwards, you had Mexicans going over the US-Mexico border to buy weed in US pharmacies. And then vice versa. In Mexico, you get Americans going to Mexico to smoke opium because it was illegal in places like California. And so you've got this wonderful ecosystem of drug consumption that is more or less penalized, but also more or less open, because back then the US-Mexico border was relatively open. And ultimately, that's what we're going to be talking about, the evolution of the drug trade, of the drug war, and why we ended up in this terrible, terrible bloodbath from such whimsy, right? A sweet little song sung on the trains of the Mexican Revolution. And it's going to be a brief journey through history. We're not going to go deep into the everyday massacres, the sort of the everyday workings of the cartels, but rather a broad sweep that I think most people are missing. Most people don't really understand why we ended up in the place that we're in right now. And we're going to conclude with a pretty big question, which a lot of people ask when they think of Mexico, which is, how unsafe is this country actually?
Let's start the way we like to start here, with a little bit of the history. So the reality is that in the first half of the 20th century, the drug trade in Mexico was still relatively small. And though we've talked about how there was some movement of drugs from Mexico to the US and Americans coming to Mexico for drugs, it was for the most part a domestic issue. However, because some degree of international trade did exist, the U.S. was already cautiously aware of Mexican policy with regards to drugs at this time. And there's a wonderful story that happens in 1940, where there was the path that Mexico had chosen as part of its domestic policy stance on drugs. And it was a beautifully progressive policy. It was a policy way ahead of its time. It's what we call today harm reduction. The idea was to treat people who were addicted to drugs as people who had a medical condition, and therefore try and help them get off of this addiction by giving them drugs in a controlled fashion. This was not only very humane and very progressive, but it was also very sensible from an economic and security standpoint, because the idea was that if the government could control drug consumption by making it available in a controlled way and very low prices, if not for free, then that would naturally push criminal gangs away from the trade because there would be no trade. The law is implemented in 1940. However, after only 4 months of being in operation, it is forced to be rolled back. And this is because of US pressure. Now, that pressure came in the form of the precursor of the DEA, because at this time, the US was already implementing the foundations of what will become the war on drugs. Now, the effect of this US meddling in Mexican domestic policy is seen almost immediately. So there's a very eerie foreshadowing in a story from late 1940 where Mexico follows that US line of being very heavy-handed against, or trying to be heavy-handed against criminal gangs that dealt with drugs. The story goes that the Mexican government sent a bunch of Mexican federal marshals to Sinaloa with the aim of destroying poppy fields and of capturing the leaders of some of these criminal enterprises. The result was that the marshals that Mexico had sent were ambushed in the mountains of Sinaloa. Their leader was ultimately captured. He was horribly tortured. He was hung from a tree and left on that tree as a message to the government that the trade would not stop. And what follows is a pivot in the Mexican approach. All this happens in a single year. And in this pivot, there's a tacit agreement that is reached with the criminals. On the one side, drugs should not be produced or sold in Mexico. However, if there is demand in the US and drugs need to pass through Mexico to get to the US, then the government is not going to do too much about it. Once at the border, it's a US problem. Let the US deal with it. And that was generally the approach that Mexico followed for many decades to follow.
I think it's fascinating to focus in on why these policies are created when they start, right? Why wasn't this the policy in the 19th century, for example? And the answer simply is the way that the products that were sold moved around in the markets that demanded them. You mentioned Sinaloa. Of course, lots of people will be very acquainted with the Sinaloa cartel. It's become one of the most infamous drug trafficking institutions on earth. But it had relatively humble origins, and its origins had everything to do with where it was and when it was. So Sinaloa is a northwestern Pacific coast state. Now, usually when I read a news story about a distant land, I usually don't care where it is in the country, but this is so important because the fact that it's close to California, but on the Pacific side of Mexico, gives Sinaloa the origins of its drug trade, starting with the Chinese migration that brought with it the opium trade, the Indian trade in marijuana, which was the sort of origin of that trade in Mexico, and then just the sheer poverty of that region. And so you've got very poor farm workers planting marijuana so that they can consume it locally, but also they're very close to what would become the world's largest drug market, the United States. And so this is where you get the origins of this. Fast forward a few decades into the middle and then the sort of second half of the 20th century, and you get this massive growth in drugs. You've got new narcotics, cocaine especially. Wall Street bankers won't let me lie. The 1980s was a time of plenty when it came to cocaine in the United States. And then new trade routes. What's really important about Sinaloa at this time is it was an age of innocence, relative innocence at least, because you had all these planters growing marijuana, which I think most people more or less think is a pretty benign drug compared to others, especially fentanyl. And then all the cocaine went from South America, where the coca leaf is grown, and through the Caribbean into Miami, past Scarface, and off to the rest of the United States. However, US intervention in the Caribbean, and then the capture of Pablo Escobar, changes that geopolitics of the drug routes. And Mexican cartels take up that vacuum and start moving cocaine through Mexico. And that changes the economics of everything. And so, again, you've got a new product, cocaine. You've got a new trade route going through Mexico via these middlemen called the cartels. But there's always one constant, and it's the US. And this is what I think is one of these difficult conversations that we always need to have, which is I'm always against painting the US as this monolithic evil bad guy in Latin American history, but it's just so difficult to not paint them that way. From the very beginning, you get this prejudice, you get these sort of moralistic, prohibitionist policies from the US that are only interested in them without considering any of the consequences downstream in Latin America. And so
linked to that, I think there's a very sort of short-sighted view that they take where the U.S. chooses not to accept the reality of addiction as a medical concern. And they tend to say, well, this is really just a problem of people not wanting to follow the law. It's a problem of the poor and of Hispanics. So the bulk of the U.S., that the white population, that's not a concern. And they keep holding that view for an exceptionally long amount of time.
You're absolutely right. And simply put, it doesn't work. It's not a policy that works. By 2024, the global drug trade is estimated at about $650 billion US dollars, most of which is consumed in the United States. So the accident of fate that puts Mexico next to the US makes it the prime place for it to become the throughway that goes from the Pacific when you're talking about fentanyl in China, from South America when you're talking about cocaine and other drugs, and then Mexico itself being a place of production for things like methamphetamines. And so you simply just can't beat the market. And you know who understood that, Tabo? The Mexican government. When you talk about how the Mexican government had a deal with the drug cartels, it sort of feels like I'm listening to J.D. Vance here, saying, well, there you are, Mexican government, corrupt. I mean, not untrue, but also realistic. Ultimately, when you're facing a completely prohibited market that you can't regulate without US intervention, you've suddenly got to make a choice, which is, do you want drug gangs to run willy-nilly with lots of money, lots of guns, because you've got the Second Amendment in the US, you can get easy access to guns, or do you want to regulate it under the table and maybe even make away with a bit of money yourself? And this is the sort of ongoing tension between Mexico and the US. Mexico decides we've got to work with the drug cartels, and the political apparatus at the time allows it. You've got the PRI, the Mexican sort of one-party state party, that, because it's not particularly democratic, actually works quite well with these drug cartels. They get their cut and they allow them to work their way up to the border. But of course, the Americans can see this. And so there's this wonderful moment where President Lyndon Johnson, talks to the Mexican government in this sort of big conference about drugs. And the Mexican president, Díaz Ordaz, reportedly says that there's a perfectly easy solution to this. Mexico, he said, is the diving board for drugs into the US. Shut down the pool, and you don't have to worry about the diving board. And this continues to be the case.
That's magnificent. Díaz Ordaz was a genius with quotes.
A terrible, terrible man. We'll probably get into that later on in some other podcast, but a good man for a quote. So that sort of brings us to 1990s, right? Where you've got very, very corrupt generals and governors in Mexico making a lot of money, pushing drugs through Mexico, to such an extent that President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who we mentioned as the father of Mexican neoliberalism, also happens to be dipping his pen into the company Inc. And so he and his brother would later on be accused of drug trafficking. So you've got this situation, and then the year 2000 comes about, and you've got a massive sea change, usually seen, I believe it is, as a massively positive development, which is the arrival of electoral democracy to Mexico in the year 2000. A center-right party, the PAN, comes to power with Vicente Fox, and they sweep into power, they get rid of the PRI, and suddenly you've got democracy. Hooray, democracy rises all boats, right? Well, not quite, because suddenly you've got this issue with very corrupt systems, very undemocratic systems, working across your country. Fox, as president from 2000 to 2006, is usually accused of not doing much, but actually maybe the issue was that he didn't know what to do with it, given the hand he was dealt. On one side, he had to deal with drug cartels without having been in on the deal with the drug cartels. And then on the other side of the border, 9/11 happens in the year 2001. And so the US government really closes down its border. And what happens? Well, you get a massive shift. You get this very big shift in how drugs need to make their way to the US because there's more security on the US side. And also, you've got this sort of government impasse with the drug cartels where they are sending troops in some places, but they're not really doing much. And then there's a bit of disruption to the whole system. And what happens? Well, people get affected. And they're not going to just sit around and wait for the government. They start taking action. And there's a really particular case, which I think is very tragic, because you've got the state of Michoacán, close to the state of Sinaloa on the Pacific side, further south. And the local cartel, the Gulf cartel, starts overstepping its line. And the local working class people again start taking up arms against the cartel. And they win.
Maybe just to clarify there, when you say overstepping the line, I think that under the tacit agreement where the drug dealers were not supposed to produce drugs in Mexico, were not supposed to sell drugs in Mexico, and that changes at this time, they also start, there begins to be problems of violence in and around the Mexican population, which was not part of the deal. And then people are forced to respond to this.
Exactly right. Yes, the complete chaos that the system is thrown into, this corrupt drugs system, but it was a stable system before, it gets thrown into disarray and it pushes people out of joint. And so these, rural workers, these farm workers, take up arms, they beat the cartel, But of course, they've had to ally with another cartel to do it, and so they become a cartel themselves. And in fact, the creation of La Familia Michoacana, named after the state where they rose up against the cartel, becomes one of the most infamous cartels. Why? Because of this weird new system. Because there's a new product, there's a new narcotic, meth, there's a new trade route because you no longer have to be in a place where you need to grow a plant like coca or marijuana. You can make it in a lab, meth. And then, but again, one constant, the United States market, this constant need for drugs pushing this whole system along.
I think in line with that, something that's super important is the system that the Mexican government had followed, in the 70s, this quote from Diaz Ordaz, it had worked. I agree, partially because there wasn't a very democratic system, but it also worked because the market wasn't that big. The problem is by the 90s, by the early 2000s, the market is colossal. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. Everyone wants in.
Exactly right. Everyone wants in. And just to give you an idea of how much money is on the table here, if you've got a ton of cocaine and you need to fly it from Central America to southern Mexico, so a tiny leg, there are cases where instead of using submarines or cars or whatever, they'd use a small biplane to fly over the Mexican border with about a ton of cocaine, and they would land the plane on a road and leave it there. This plane is about $1 million back then. And they could just leave that. That was a sunk cost that they didn't mind losing because the cocaine was so valuable. So I think we see the end of this corrupt, undemocratic system of stability, which I think is a weird thing to contemplate, right? Like, hooray for authoritarian, corrupt governments, and how sad we've got a new democratic government. But that was just simply the case. We're in a brave new world where we've got democracy reigns, but we've still got corruption. And so what is a Mexican president to do?
So this brings us to 2006. Vicente Fox leaves office and Felipe Calderón from the same party wins the presidency. Now, the story goes that when he comes into office, there's an intelligence meeting and he reportedly receives terrifying intelligence. This intelligence that came from both U.S. intelligence sources and Mexican sources allegedly said that the federal government's loss of control of the country was imminent. Why? Because government and armed forces at all levels were either already on the narco payroll or they were soon to be. So basically the argument was the declaration of war was inevitable.
That, of course, seems very convenient for a man coming into office and saying, dear, I've just won an election on a very tenuous margin and a lot of Mexico thinks I cheated. I need something big to get this off people's minds. And that's what a lot of people argue. People on the side of the candidate who lost against Felipe Calderón, a man called Andrés Manuel López Obrador, claimed that really the drug war was an excuse to push away the issues, to push away the claims of fraud, and to legitimize his government.
Yes, definitely. And that seems to make sense. Not only that, but also we're not sure that this meeting ever happened. And even if it did, we can't be certain of what was said or whether the information could be trusted. Rumor is an important source of information in politics in Mexico. A lot of this stuff is still confidential. So we can't be certain. However, what we do know for sure is that by 2007, 90% of all cocaine going into the U.S. was going through Mexico. Mexico now not only transported but produced a very wide range of drugs, like we said, meth, and the cartels had become very sophisticated enterprises. They were cash rich and they were heavily, heavily armed. So, for whatever reason, but knowing these facts, Calderón declares war in 2007. And because Mexico couldn't do this alone, and because Mexico was right in saying that the bulk of the drugs are being sold in the U.S., Mexico reaches out to the U.S. and proposes a cooperation agreement. And that cooperation agreement, which does happen, and it goes on from 2007 till 2021, is called Plan Mérida, the Mérida Initiative. And the idea of the initiative was that the U.S. would help Mexico with intelligence, with weapons, with money, and most importantly, with the training of its security forces. The result, widely accepted generally, is that it was all a massive disaster. There were a lot of intelligence mistakes made. There was no real financial approach to the war. I mean, some of it was done, but for the most part, there wasn't a serious attempt at seizing the financial assets at a wholesale level of these organizations, which many argue would have been more successful. The government underestimated their adversaries, not recognizing that these were sophisticated, at this point, military groups. They just went around cutting heads under the hope that by cutting the head of the different cartels, the cartels would kind of just fizzle away. But like Hercules and the Hydra, for every head they cut, 2 heads, 3 heads would spring up. The cartels fragmented and started fighting not only the government, but themselves.
And just to add, one of the saddest episodes of the Plan Merida was the fact that because they didn't deal with corruption, because they didn't deal with the fact that lots of parts of the Mexican state were permeated by the cartels, one of the things that happened was the US Special Forces came in to train the Mexican Special Forces, who quickly became another cartel in themselves, the Zetas. And so it's just this disastrous episode of extreme violence in the eastern side of Mexico, completely created and put on steroids by this United States obsession with quelling drugs without dealing with the actual issues at hand, their own consumption, the financial flows, and the flow of guns.
In the end, you have, mostly from the Zetas, a group of highly trained elite warriors armed to the teeth, just killing each other all over the country. The result is that by the end of 2012, Felipe Calderón's presidency, officially around 65,000 people die. Others estimate the numbers at almost 120,000 people. The next president, Enrique Peña Nieto, who was in office from 2012 to 2018, essentially followed the same policy, with the same Plan Merida, a little bit of rebranding and renaming here and there, but for the most part, the same thing. By the end of his presidency, it is estimated that an additional between 150 and 200,000 people were dead from the war on drugs.
Now, one would expect that at this point of the story, 2018, everything should have changed. You suddenly get a very new brand of government coming in under President López Obrador, who, as we mentioned before, has claimed that Calderón had committed a fraud to get to the presidency. Well, he's now in power, and he's got a pretty big majority. He's got a lot of power to deal with cartels. He'd arrived and campaigned on this idea of hugs, not bullets. Now, I sort of hate when I hear international media talk about this because they talk about it as if it was still the Mexican government's policy. And yet, really, you see López Obrador say hugs, not bullets. What does that mean, right? It means we're going to deal with the causes of violence, not just tackle violence with violence. But then he arrives at government, and that ceases to be a slogan. And indeed, the policy of prevention of violence ceases to be the policy altogether. Now, we don't know why this is again, right? Like, there's rumor, there is speculation. Maybe it's corruption, or maybe it's an army takeover. Maybe the army is so powerful now in this long war on drugs that they control everything. Or, and I think this is the most likely version, López Obrador arrived in government, saw the classified files, saw the situation in Mexico, and said, oh God, we can't change tack just yet. And so we go from attending the causes of violence, which they do try to do. They do a lot of redistribution. It's made them very popular, but it hasn't changed the rate of deaths. We've got about close to 500,000 dead people between 2006 and 2024, with the rate not really slowing down under López Obrador. And really, why is that? Because even though you do want to attend the causes of violence, no matter how much money you give to people for free in the form of redistribution, the genie has already been let out of the bottle. So much money is flowing through this system, through the sale of drugs, that it's almost impossible to tempt people out of that system because you can become rich. And the consequences on the government side are actually pretty low. You're not going to go to prison. Impunity is rampant. And violence is pretty terrible, but it's sort of part of the ethos of the drug cartel life, right? Like you're like a pirate. It's swashbuckling, short, but glorious. And so Mexico creates a national guard. It continues to militarize its approach. And the sort of civilian solution to this problem starts going away into the distance. And that sort of brings us to the present day, right? A lot of what I've mentioned, so the National Guard and the new approach I'm about to talk about, is available, a lot of it more analysis than we can get into right now, on the Mexico Political Economist. So, quick ad. Do subscribe, become a subscriber, support this podcast by subscribing to mxp.org, the Mexico Political Economist, where you'll get a lot more about the National Guard and the new approach under now President Claudia Sheinbaum, where you get a slight change, a bit of hope, I think. Yes, a lot more intelligence work. Yes, a bit more focus on the finances, but also a sort of change in the power structure that you can see from the outside, which is a new sort of super policeman coming into view, which is Omar Garcia Harfuch, Sheinbaum's new security minister, who seems to be taking control of the most violent and corrupt parts of the Mexican drug war. He is almost permanently stationed in Sinaloa now. So we'll see how that goes, but at least it's the inkling of the beginning of a new strategy. So even though violence is still pretty terrible and there is a literal narco-civil war going on in Sinaloa as we speak, maybe this change will give us some results.
Yes, and we can only hope that that will be the case, because the only reason this matters is because of the broader question of how this affects the population. How does it affect civilians, the 130 million people who are not involved in the drug trade and who live in this context of violence, of almost 500,000 people dead as a result of the war on drugs? Now, to answer that question, it's a little bit tricky, because the reality has varied enormously by region and through time. So in the early years, the north of the country was in absolute chaos. Michoacan, as you mentioned, Alex, the state of Guerrero as well. Violence, it wasn't just that the cartels were fighting each other and the government. That violence then spilled out onto the streets, and there's very tragic cases of students being gunned down in the city of Monterrey, of people being gunned down in the streets in Tijuana. These things did happen. And through time, almost every state in the country has seen a period of extraordinary security risk to the average civilian. Even super safe cities historically super safe cities like Monterrey at one point became very dangerous for all. Now, it's not, or at least my perspective, it's not that there's just willy-nilly shootings going around all the time. It's not that the narco is actively targeting civilians. The problem tends to be when people, so to speak, don't stay in their lane or they see things that they shouldn't, then there's violence. But for the most part, for the average civilian, things have been generally fine.
Well, here you've used the right word, because I'd push back a bit on that, which is if you're dealing with a narco and you stick to your lane, as in you don't sell drugs and you don't traffic drugs on their turf, sure, they'll leave you alone. But as the cartels have diversified away from drugs, it has begun to touch upon everyday life. So you've got people who own shops in different parts of Mexico suddenly having to pay a protection tax because of this moving tide of violence. When you own a farm, you've got to pay the local drug lord a fee from your yields. And so suddenly you get this seeping of cartel violence, which we used to call narco, but now it's just organized crime, seeping into everyday life and becoming very difficult to distinguish from the normal economy. This is why the terrorist designation by the US of cartels is so tricky, both for Mexico and the United States, because if you deal with a cartel as an American company, you are in for a lot of trouble with the law. And yet, maybe it's you just buying avocados that, unbeknownst to you, is you dealing with a local drug cartel.
Yes, definitely. As you say, what's important is that they've pivoted away from just drugs. The number of things that they are now involved in, all criminal activities, is extraordinary. And that really does penetrate all parts of the Mexican economy across the entire country. So one of the worst things that they're involved in, and most affects the average person, is extortion. So there's protection money that needs to be paid. So cartels will come in and say, you need to pay me some money and I will protect you from the other cartels. Or if you don't pay, you'll also have to be concerned about my own violence. So that's a very important component. And there's very violent repercussions for people who snitch. So there was a recent case of a businessman from the state of Tamaulipas in the northeast of the country. He went to Brownsville and said publicly that it was very difficult to do business in Mexico because of extortion. When he came back to Matamoros on the other side of the border, he was violently gunned down almost a few hours after making the statements. And the other thing, and I believe is the most nefarious of all of their activities, is the sex trade. So it is estimated by the U.S. State Department that between 15 and 100,000 young people, mostly women, are sold into some form of sexual slavery in the US every single year. Now, a huge number of those people come through Mexico. And it is the organized crime that began as the narco that's behind all of this.
Now I'm going to say something on the other side of the argument I just made, which is we've made it seem a lot like what the US government says is happening, which is everything is permeated by crime, and therefore there's basically no hope for the Mexican state or Mexican society. And yet, Mexico's so big and diverse that ultimately there are enormous parts of the country, like Merida and the Yucatan Peninsula generally, with the exception of Cancun, that work quite well without organized crime. And there are sort of safe havens among them where drug trafficking and organized crime permeates but doesn't affect everyday life. One of the most pernicious things about the current US government is that they've made it seem like there is no hope for Mexico, and that justifies the US government's intervention. And yet, arguably, one of the biggest issues continues to be everything that happens on the US side, both corruption, which has permeated into the United States, but also the illegal drug flow, usually carried out by American citizens. 80% of the drugs that go into the US are moved by US citizens. The illegal traffic of arms, 75% of which come into Mexico via the US illegally. And all these other issues stateside that are not being dealt with, that if we made a whole podcast about how corrupt that system is, you'd probably say the US is a failed state as well. And so it's the deep complexity of this issue that makes it so difficult to deal with in a serious manner. But I see a few glimmers of hope. I don't know if you've been following the tariff wars, Tabor.
A little bit, particularly on the Mexican Political Economist.
Wow, thank you very much. I was unpaid and unscripted, by the way. But crucially, what I thought was one of the sort of small victories from that debacle was that, sure, Mexico promised to deal with migration and the flow of fentanyl into the US with using the National Guard, which is, again, not a new strategy. It has already been deployed and has been prepared in part to appease the US government. But the Mexican strategy was very effective because it drove all these points home, saying the US is just as at fault, or in lots of ways more at fault than the Mexican government is. So you need to work with us, not punish us. And one unprecedented concession was the fact that the US has promised to try to stop the flow of high-caliber weapons going into Mexico from the US. Believe it or not, no administration, Democratic or Republican, has ever really admitted to, let alone try to help with that issue, mostly because they don't want to scare the NRA and the other gun people in America. But it's simply one of the main driving forces behind the violence in this country.
That is indeed a change of tack from the American side, and a very important one, because the literally caliber of weapons that make it into Mexico just make the ability of the cartels to fight the government quite extraordinary. So if you can control that flow of guns, that can make a real difference. And also, hopefully, it is a sign of further concessions to be made.
Well, we've got new administrations on both sides of the border. Hopefully, some sense will prevail. And meanwhile, Mexicans go along with their lives as usual. The economy chugs along despite the violence. People get on with their lives. People get married. People are born. People die of natural causes, sometimes relatively unscathed by the drug trade and organized crime. So hopefully things get better. We'll keep you posted. But meanwhile, I'm Alex Gonzalez-Omrod.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And this is Mexico, the podcast. Tune in every 2 weeks where we talk about Mexican politics, policy, and markets, and the history behind it all.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist.
Bye for now.